Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to respond to the Treasurer's speech. I'll try and keep it short. I'd like to first commend the Treasurer on his speech on the mid-year economic report, fiscal report. I mean, for the benefit of the members, I think it was earlier raised by the former Prime Minister and member for Yalibu, is the date that this report is due. So it's actually provided by legislation under Section 9 of the PNG Fiscal Responsibility Act that requires the presentation of the mid-year report by the end of July. If not July, then 6 months after the last report. So we are now in the early stages of September, so it's essentially a month late from the first date, not months late, a month late, so to speak, and also within the 6 months between the last budget report. But, Mr. Speaker, this report is timely in a time that not only PNG but the globe is affected by COVID. It is real. Other countries have shut their border. Other countries have shut down their own citizens. This is not something to take lightly. So even talking about promoting our tourism, who will fly here when they can't even fly out of their own country? This is the reality of the world we now live in COVID. On the issue, Mr. Speaker, on IMF. Now it's important that we put some context into the issue of IMF. While the former or current Shadow Minister for Treasurer raised that the last point of call is an issue when a country faces balance of payments. So when did the Marape government go to IMF? Did we go after 3 or 4 years after running the economy down?
We have a point of order.
Slight correction, Mr. Speaker. I'm not the Shadow Treasurer. That is, in fact, the Honourable Lelang. That's all. Thank you.
Point of order is in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did the Marape government go to IMF soon after assuming office, having a full assessment of the real state of the economy of the country, or did we go after 3 years of running it into the ground and then needing to go to IMF? And the answer is it went soon after we took office. On the basis we had a fair assessment of the state of the economy, balance of payments, and in terms of our debt issues and more so governance. Now, why a lot of developing countries do not go to IMF is because IMF not only provide technical advice, but more concern to them is they ensure a high degree of governance. When you borrow from them, as a member country, there is conditions in how you spend the money. Because clearly, if you have an issue with your economy and you don't have cash, you clearly misspent it somewhere. And becoming a member country for IMF, its idea is to protect other members' economy. And on that basis, by offering cheap concessional loans, but also ensuring governance. And this is why some developing countries who run by people who are basically known for misusing money or misspending money through whatever corrupt means or bad investments like 1.5 billion US UBS loan, they would struggle to get support from IMF because they would struggle adhering to governance structures. Yes? So this is what the central issue when you go to IMF. You have to clean up your books and clean up your act. And if you don't, they don't lend you the money. On the issue of the debt, I'd like to acknowledge the Treasurer for actually providing data. When we were members of the opposition, it was very difficult to get data on what PNG's real debt was. And he states clearly that it is 40 billion. I think he left out the GDP% ratio, though. But to give context, the Japan's current GDP, what you borrow versus against what the growth of your economy is 256%. So they are essentially double borrowed, twice the size of their economy. So why are they able to borrow so much? It's because they have sensible spending. And the problem with PNG and why we created a law that blocks us from borrowing is because we have a history of misspending money recklessly. But unfortunately, we're in COVID. So we were one of the lowest GDP debt ratios down to 35% required in law. Other countries do not create a law to block the government borrowing, only Papua New Guinea, because we have a bad record of borrowing too much and spending it badly. So while our debt is at 40 billion, the issue now going forward is to keep the country afloat So there's talk about talking positive, get the economy going. Where are we going? Where's anyone going? Now, the former Prime Minister mentioned about other economies that are growing. Yes, Australia, New Zealand, the most least impacted by COVID because they shut their border down. Yes, and the economies are large enough to sustain itself. We aren't. So we are not in the position of Australia and New Zealand. However, in recent times, they've just been smashed by COVID. And the economy now, their GDP growth is going basically backwards from initially projected in the 4%, now down to 2.4. So clearly, they're impacted by COVID. Mr. Speaker, the key issue is about governance and trust in how we spend the people's money. That is the key issue. So we can borrow more, yes, provided we spend it wisely, that we invest in our future of our children and their children. And provided we invest it properly and spend it properly, we will get the long-term returns. When we invest it into speculative markets like a UBS loan and we lose 1.5 billion, we end up in significant debt that we can't service. Now, the government spent 5.7 billion. Now, what the public doesn't realize, they thought that we spent it on COVID. Actually, we didn't. We spent it to keep the government going, to meet payroll, to pay police officers, to maintain peace and good order, to pay teachers, to pay nurses, to pay CIS, to maintain our prisons. So we, having impacted by COVID, as they said, lost jobs. So over 2 billion was lost in our revenue. So where are we going to get 2 billion to keep the government going? So we borrowed. We're now paying 2 billion in interest rate, not repaying a loan. Interest rate is what we are paying every year, just the interest. The loan stays, we got to keep paying the same interest. So when we lose revenue because of COVID, impacts of COVID, where do we get 2 billion to maintain that interest payment? We have to borrow. That's the reality. The only issue is provided we borrow sensibly. In this case, we borrowed from institutions that gave concessionable loans at the lowest to zero interest rate. So instead of increasing to 2 billion and up on our interest by borrowing from banks who offer up to 7%, we borrow at close to 0.2%. So therefore, it doesn't increase our loan repayments, because when it increases our loan repayments, we have to get the money from somewhere. Either we borrow or we take it out of the development budget. Money that's supposed to build hospitals, build classrooms, now is spent to pay debt. And that's all, Mr. Speaker. Now, thank you, too.